That's all we want to do.
You are all so quiet this morning. It's amazing. I'll just get started while you finish up with your coffee. If you're new and you just stopped in today and you're kind of jumping into the middle of a series on the life of Joseph, this is week 4. And one of the things we've discovered about Joseph is that he is a character in the Bible who undergoes a lot of changes in his character. He's a character who undergoes character changes. An individual. And who we meet at the end of this series is a much different man than we encounter at the beginning of the series. And the pathway that God takes him on to become the kind of man that he needs to be is a difficult, long, hard journey that oftentimes leaves Joseph as being victimized in a number of ways. And yet what we discover about Joseph is that while he has been victimized and terrible things happen to him and offenses are made against him, Joseph never adopts the behavior or the mindset of a victim. All right, so that doesn't become his identity. Certainly bad things happen to Joseph, but he doesn't let them define who he is. That's a very hard journey for us because all of us have been victimized, some to a greater extent, some to a lesser extent, but all of us have gone through things that have left us wounded and hurt, and we have regrets, and those instances in our lives have the capacity to completely reorient the shape of who we become, both in a good way and in a bad way. And so we're looking at Joseph's life to see how does he handle these moments when he's victimized so he becomes a mature, healthy person on the other side. That's what we're trying to discover here. Last week, the end of chapter 39, we discovered that Joseph is put in prison. He is on false charges of sexual harassment, and now we pick up the story in chapter 40. So I'm going to read the whole chapter 40 to us today. It'll be on the screen as well, and then we will get into the text. So, here we are. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. By the way, we learned in chapter 39 that the captain of the guard was Potiphar. So it's fascinating that Joseph is not killed by Potiphar on these charges. Most commentators believe or think that Potiphar, his former slave boss, didn't actually believe his wife's accusations, but in order to kind of save face, culturally, he put Joseph in prison and then promptly puts Joseph in charge of the prison as a prisoner. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should have put me into this pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "Hey," I added the hey, "I also had a dream, and there were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat the flesh from you. That's right, that's how they felt too. And on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hands. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. All right. I'm going to call this sermon The Pause in the Promise. The Pause in the Promise. And the reason for that is, I think that Moses, who writes this down in Genesis, is I think, and the way that this story unfolds, is reminiscent of Joseph's 2 dreams that he had in the very first week when we met him. And as a 17-year-old, he has a dream, he has 2 dreams, and in these dreams, there are a number of things that happen, but basically he dreams that his brothers and his mother and father bow down before him. And so he, at that point, as a 17-year-old, is rather arrogant and disrespectful, and that dream doesn't go over well enough. However, they are prophetic in the sense that they were from God, and while Joseph mishandled them in the way he went around telling people that they were going to someday bow down to him, they were a snapshot of a future for him. Right? And now, in this scene, once again, we encounter 2 dreams, right? Which take us back to the 2 dreams that Joseph had. Probably took Joseph back to his dreams. The fact that Joseph feels confident in his ability to discern from the Lord what these dreams mean tells me that Joseph still believes in his ability to interpret dreams, and that dreams are meaningful and have value and God is speaking through them. And so he probably hasn't given up on his own dreams that God gave to him earlier. Sometimes God gives us a picture of our future or something he has for us, even though we are not where we should be emotionally or spiritually or even competently. All right? So Joseph was not at a place in his life when he was 17 and he received these visions from the Lord. And he wasn't the kind of man he needed to be to live those dreams out. But God still entrusted those dreams to Joseph in that season of his life. What Joseph had trouble discovering was how the now, where he was now, could possibly be a part of their future fulfillment. The events of his life have taken him in a direction completely opposite of anything that makes a semblance of sense to those dreams actually happening. Here he is, hundreds of miles from his family. They think that his dad thinks that he is dead. He is in prison. He couldn't be further removed from the possibility of those things coming to fruition than where he is now. Sometimes Jesus gives us a promise or a glimpse of a dream that he has for us in our future. And the details are kind of vague. Like, we have an idea of where he's taking us, a call in our lives towards something, but we don't really know how to all the details. It's like a connect the dots, right? Like we kind of get the shape and the pattern of what it's going to be, but we really don't know all of the details. And that's the way he does it intentionally, so that we trust him each step of the way. The challenge for us is that we often want to connect the dots on our own and manufacture something in the meantime. I'm reminded of 1 Corinthians 13:12. It says, Paul writes, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we're going to see God face to face. I know in part, but someday I will know fully." Like, Paul understands that there's seasons, these times in our lives when God puts something on our heart, but there's not a lot of clarity around how it's going to happen. And that's a normal part of following Jesus. He seldom gives us a playbook with exact, calls on what we're going to do in the future of our lives. And in those moments, the temptation is to fill in the blanks ourselves or to make assumptions. I want to just walk us through a couple instances where this has played out before. So Joseph, a couple generations, his great-grandfather was Abraham. And if he has paid attention, he could have remembered that Abraham, at one point, received a promise from God that someday he would be the father of many nations. The problem with that promise is that for years after he gets that promise, he and his wife can't have any children. They're infertile. And so once again, the promise of God is not making sense in the moment, in his here and now. In Abraham's life, he attempts to manufacture the promise by sleeping with his wife's servant Hagar, which creates further problems. Eventually, in God's time, he brings about the fulfillment of that with the birth of Isaac. And so there's a warning there that in those moments when we think we know what God wants, to be patient in the now. When the promise has a pause on it, it's okay. You've got other moments in time. Gideon in the Old Testament, during the time of the Judges, he is told to go defeat the Amalekites, and then the journey to that battle, on their way to the battle, God continues to reduce the number of troops that Gideon has, so that by the time he actually goes to battle, he's got about 300 warriors, completely outnumbered. It makes no sense, the pathway that God had Gideon on, but Gideon trusted, and as a result, won a pretty amazing battle. You have Moses, who's told by God he's going to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt to the promised land. And yet on that journey from the promised land, or from Egypt to the promised land, the Israelites often ask him to let them go back to Egypt. They don't want to be on this journey. They get stuck in a 40-year-long detour because of their disobedience and their hard-heartedness. There have to have been many moments in Moses' life when he said, God, you've made this promise to me, but the right now is really hard. And I don't understand how right now is going to become a future reality like you've claimed it should be. In the New Testament, Jesus and his disciples get into a boat. Jesus says to them, take me to the other side of the lake. In that command, there's an inherent promise, right? We're going to get to the other side of the lake. Across the lake, they encounter this fierce storm. The disciples think they're going to drown, and they wake Jesus up. Jesus is sleeping in the boat, and he kind of rebukes them for their lack of faith. He very specifically rebukes them for their lack of faith. And you see, Jesus, as a picture for us, understood that there was a promise, there was a call on his life that at this moment did not involve him drowning, right? And so he was able to rest during the storm because he knew that there was a prophetic call on his life as well. But let's face it, that takes incredible maturity, right? Because in the storm, and in the prison, and in our infertility, and in the face of insurmountable odds, all that we see in those moments is our now, and how now makes no sense in light of the future. And that's what Joseph is facing in this moment as well. Mark Barnard wrote a book about Joseph's life, and he says that Joseph's gift of dream interpretation helps him to discern the future, but understanding his present proves more difficult. And I think many of us understand what that's like, to be in a season of our lives where we just look around and we're like, how can this have any meaning or any purpose in God's call on me? In those moments, it's easy to try to manufacture the promise. And I don't want to be too hard on Joseph, but I kind of wonder, and a couple commentaries as I studied this, said that maybe that's what he's doing in verse 14. So he interprets these dreams in Genesis 40, and then in particular with the cupbearer, he says to him, only remember me when it is well with you. For Joseph, he's thinking, here's my opportunity. I've been stuck in prison. The man in charge of me is the one who put me here. Chances of me getting out are pretty slim. Maybe this is my pathway. Here's a divine opportunity to get me out of prison. And so he kind of pins some hopes on this guy. And a cupbearer is not just, he's an important individual. He probably had hundreds of employees under him. He was in charge of not just taking a sip out of the chalice to see if it was poisoned, but more importantly, kind of sourcing the food and drink for the king, for Pharaoh. And so he was a man of influence. He's the kind of guy that probably could put a bug in Pharaoh's ear and get Joseph out of there. And so a couple commentators said that maybe in this scene there's just a little bit of control still left in Joseph's life. Hey, maybe this is how I can get out of here. And his asking the butler to remember him reminds me of moments in my own life that I have looked to other people to fulfill ambitions that are simply not God's timing yet. If you've been there, you just try to make something happen and it just doesn't work. Joseph doesn't realize that to be released from prison right now would not accomplish the task that God has for him. What would he do? Go home? There are things that need to fall into place externally and internally in his own life that he has no idea about before God can move him into the next season that he has for him. That's a tough place to be. He is forgotten for 2 years. 2 years. That's what the last verse tells us. It's probably one of the saddest. Actually, I should say chapter 41, verse 1 tells us that. That the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. 41, verse 1. It's not on the slides, but it says, after 2 whole years, God begins the journey into the next season for him. I can only imagine Joseph in his cell, day 1. The cupbearer is back in the king's service, and Joseph is thinking, certainly he'll remember me today. Day 2. Well, maybe it wasn't the right time yet, Maybe he was busy catching up on all the work he missed while he was in prison, and little tally marks are starting to show up on the cell wall. Day 3, day 4, and eventually you just give up counting. Eventually you're just tired, and you think, this is where I am going to be forever. Being forgotten and overlooked is a unique kind of pain. Some of you remember being chosen last on the playground or the game. Some of you have watched other people, less competent individuals, be promoted around you because of their ability to play workplace politics. And there is an easy bitterness that creeps into our lives in those moments, the kind of bitterness that makes us resentful and that causes us to take on a victim mentality where we just resign ourselves to being where we are forever. We can believe the lie that God has forgotten us as well. Joseph is overlooked and forgotten. And in Joseph's life, this is a uniquely painful experience because he is an unforgettable kind of a guy, right? Up to this point in his life, even in the darkest places that he goes, God's favor continues to kind of rise into the surface. In Potiphar's house, as a slave, he quickly becomes in charge of the house. Everyone knows who Joseph is. In prison, even in this moment, he's now in charge of the prison. And while it's not that great for prisoners to know who you are, he is still someone that people know. And if you go even further back, when he goes to find his brothers out in the field with the sheep, there's this verse that came to my mind in chapter 37, verse 18. It says that the brothers saw Joseph from afar. He was just an unforgettable character. He wore flashy clothes. He was used to being remembered, right? And now, God has to teach him a lesson about what it's like to be overlooked and forgotten. It's part of that humble process that he has Joseph on in his journey. He languishes in prison. God is forming in Joseph, I believe, an identity that isn't dependent on him being known by others, but simply known by the Father. Right? The last verse of the previous chapter, chapter 39, tells us that God's presence was with Joseph in prison. So he's known by God, he's just not known by Pharaoh. Some of us like to be known by people in authority. We pin our affirmation on whether or not the boss knows who we are and if he likes us or not. It's not healthy. And God is breaking that in Joseph's life here. The presence of God was with Joseph when the presence of others was not. And it's always sad. Some of us have met people who have not been able to move on in their lives, that are still kind of reliving the glory days of before. And they're not learned the painful process of simply resting in the love of God and not in the affirmation of others. It's like when I think of Joseph in this season, it's like he gets the job interview that he's been waiting for and then waits by the phone day after day, hoping for a callback that never comes. The reason that Christians have hope in our moments of abandonment and loss and being forgotten is because we follow Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ experienced the worst abandonment of all on our behalf. As he was on the cross, some of his very final words to the Father on our behalf was this: Father, why have you forsaken me? Jesus could have complained about a whole lot of things on the cross. The deep physical pain that he was in, the anguish of his friends turning away, his mother standing there watching him die. And yet one of the final things that he just screams out to the Father is this, "Why have you abandoned me?" You see, on the cross, Jesus took the most severe abandonment that we could ever imagine so that we would never have to know what it's like to be apart from the love of the Father. That's a beautiful truth that we get to hang our hats on as followers of Jesus Christ. And some of us are trying to get through our aloneness apart from God's love. The one who said to us, "I will never leave you or forsake you." No asterisks, no unless you screw up or unless you make a bad decision, then I'm going to abandon you. Unless you've made decisions that lead you to being forsaken by your friends, then I might leave you too. Because one of the lies the enemy speaks to us when we're abandoned is the lie that we deserve it, right? The fact that, well, you know what, if I had just made different decisions, then I wouldn't be in this space. If only I had been a better brother, Joseph could have said to himself. If only I hadn't behaved the way I did, maybe my now would be different. And yet the love of the Father continues for us, even irregardless of the things that we have done to get us in that point in life. Jesus took the pain on the cross so that the Father would never turn away from us. When have you turned in faith to the open arms of the Father? If you are languishing in aloneness and feeling forgotten today, I want you to know that you're not going to find your affirmation in someone else's love in your life. You're only going to find your affirmation in the love of the Father, and his arms are open wide to you. Finally, I think that what Joseph's journey takes him on is a letting go of his timeline to God's timeline in this season. Finally, we must all get to the place in our lives where we abandon our plans and our dreams to the Father's plans and dreams. We can say, honestly, I don't understand how this season of my life has any purpose for me in the future, but I trust that you are good and that some way, God, you're going to redeem this season for me. And while Joseph is the victim of being forgotten, he is pursuing excellence in his prison vocation. Same author writes this. He says, "In order for our hearts to be in the place God wants, it often involves forgetting imagined outcomes for our lives, our agenda, and our plans. Then God can promote us to the next step of his plan." We don't abandon the promise of God, but we die to our interpretation of the promise, right? There's a beautiful verse in John chapter 12, verse 24. It says, "Unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it can never bear fruit." The death of our dreams and kind of the death of ourselves is the ordinary journey that God takes his children on so that they can grow into fruitful followers of Jesus Christ. If I've been hard on Joseph in this series, I do want to cut him a break, because while he's being formed in a mature man during these years, and while there are moments where we might say, "Joseph, maybe you shouldn't have done that," he continues to be present with the Father in difficult situations. Recently, I saw a quote. It said, "Be where your feet are," right? Instead of just thinking about the future, pay attention to your present and see where God has you now and steward that moment well. We can be so preoccupied with our future plans sometimes that we neglect where God has us in the moment. So sometimes that means we have to reimagine our prison as a school. We have to recognize that I don't like where I am right now, and I'm hoping that this is a season and God's going to move me into something greater. But for right now, in this moment, I don't want to waste the pain. Does that make sense? If you're going to endure the suffering that you're in, then let's endure it well so that it matures us into the kinds of people that God can use. There are things being formed in our lives that will bear much fruit in the future. God is treating us as sons and daughters. And those moments, those 2 years in prison kind of seasons, have the opportunity to either make us bitter victims or press us into the arms of Jesus. And our decisions in those seasons are crucial. They will define what becomes of us, how we interact in the prison season challenges and shapes who we become in the future. Just in closing, I think just a beautiful benediction, and the worship team can come up at this time as well. Are Paul's words in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. So I've selected some passages, verses 7 to 11 and 16 to 18. Paul says this, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Commonplace, we might be afflicted in every way, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed at times, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh." Verse 16. "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." There are two things sometimes that I do in my life when I am stressed out or exhausted. One is I remember a passage that Jesus, in the scriptures that say that, what is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And while that might sound cold on the surface, it puts in perspective the briefness of what I do in my life here, in my ministry, whether that's being a dad or a husband or a pastor. And the other thing that I once read said that one of the greatest spiritual disciplines we can do is to go for a prayer walk to a cemetery and just recognize that we're all going to die, right? And this is a light momentary affliction, but we do this so that someday we will be in the presence of Jesus, and it will be sweet in that moment. In the now, Jesus produces unseen eternal realities in our lives. He renews our inner self day by day. Maybe today you just need a fresh renewal, a fresh perspective, and that's going to require some open-handedness on your part to say, Jesus, I want to receive from whatever you have for me in this season right now, so that I can become the kind of man and woman who will be fruitful in later seasons also. So I'm just going to pray that blessing for us, and then we'll sing together. In this room, Jesus, there are many stories represented, many places of grief and pain, and some of those are happening now. Some of us are in our prison cells now. And so I'm praying for those in that season, that they would be able to reimagine this season as a school, as a time to learn, and especially to learn the deep and abiding love of the Father, one who never forsakes us, one who never abandons us. And so would you just give us a revelation of your presence in this moment? Help us to feel deeply in our souls how much you love us, Jesus. I ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
So this is a new song.